Well, welcome all of our guests to our 2020 Utah Legislative Wrap-Up. We had originally, of course, planned to do this event, as we traditionally have after every legislative session, in person and to supply you with a fabulous box lunch. But as with many things now in 2020, we have moved this to a webinar, and unfortunately, you'll have to supply your own lunch. But we're still excited to tell you about the 2020 legislative session. And we are, of course, going to save a little bit of time at the end, too, for general questions. Just to let everyone know, we've applied for 1 hour of CLE credit for today's presentation. And if you need to request the CLE credit, please email Cindy Phippen at our office. Her email is cphippen@hollandhart.com. So CPHIPPEN@hollandhart.com. If you get stuck on how to apply for those credits, feel free to just let me or Steve or Billy know, and we'll be happy to connect you so that you can get that credit. Today's program, we're going to do 3 sections for our 3 presenters. I'm going to be going first and discussing kind of the opening of our session and some policy areas and discussing the bills in each of those areas. Then we'll hear from Steve Young, who will be covering tax issues, tax reform. And finally, we'll hear from Billy Hesterman, who's going to cover the budget, rainy day funds, potential for a special session, and things like that. We will pause after each presenter, so if you have questions, please use the Q&A option on your screen, and we can address those questions after each section, and then we'll also be happy to take any questions at the end. So we'll go ahead and get started. And of course, we have offices across the Mountain West. We do traditional legal services, but have government affairs teams that do lobbying and public policy in each of our 8 Western states and our DC office as well. So don't just think of us for Utah, think of us for those other states if you have needs there as well. So this is a perennial chart I like to make to talk about the pace of our session. Utah's session is 45 days. It's actually 33 working days. Because keep in mind that's 45 calendar days. Traditionally, Utah legislature does not work on weekends. And the biggest issue in our session is, quite frankly, making it through the process before we adjourn. As you can see, for a long time, our chart has been like fairly steady in terms of the number of bills passed, number of bills introduced, but we see in 2020 a kind of an interesting phenomenon where the bills introduced took a big upturn, but the bills passed went down. So we had about 1,300 bill requests. So that's a legislator asking for something to be drafted. But bills that received a number and were actually introduced was 1,053 bills. Ultimately, we passed 510 bills. And you can see the little yellow line takes a dip this year from where it had been the past couple of years. It's not our lowest mark on the chart. The lowest of the last decade was in 2016 when we only passed 474 bills. This was a very interesting session, and Steve will be covering some of the reasons why in his tax section after my section. But we entered our session under a little bit of a rain cloud, not the current rain cloud that we're under, but for Utah, a specific rain cloud on tax reform, and a special session that took place in December of 2019 where tax reform was enacted, a very comprehensive sweeping tax reform bill that we covered in our session preview. But there was a citizens referendum to place that on the ballot, and it looked like it was gathering steam at the beginning of the session, and so the legislature ultimately repealed that bill. And it put a little bit of a rain cloud, particularly over the beginning of our session. There was also a lot of staff fatigue. The tax reform efforts had really taxed our legislative staff for the entire summer and fall of 2019. The legislature has a small staff because we have a short session, and they work very, very hard, and part of the trade-off is this downtime they're able to have during the interim period, and they didn't get that this year. So there was a lot of kind of, I think, staff fatigue. We also lost a few drafting attorneys right before the session started and some dock technicians. So one of the things that we really experienced this year was that while we did have an uptick of bills numbered, they came very late in our session, and that definitely impacted their ability to pass and make it all the way through the process before our session ended. And you can see that shows up here in another graph I like to talk about every year of how many bills passed each week of our 7-week session. And this year, only one bill passed the first week. It was the repeal of tax reform. And you can see for every week after, except for the final week, we are well off pace. And there was definitely struggles for multiple bills to just get drafted, to get the process started so they could have a committee hearing, go to a floor vote, switch chambers, do the same thing. And so the pace of our session definitely was thrown off this year, and it definitely impacted the number of bills that were able to make it through the process this session. In fact, looking at weeks 2 and 3 and 4, we're almost 10 to 15, and in week 4, 20 bills off our normal pace of passage, which is really important in our session because it is so short that bills continue to make their way all the way through the process. We recover and actually exceed the week 7 from 2019 by passing 316 bills in the final week versus 307. But it was definitely an interesting session from beginning to end, starting with that repeal of tax reform, ending on worries about the coronavirus and the way the final week definitely impacted legislators' worries about the transmission of that virus. So moving on to some of the important topics of our session. Air quality is a perennial issue for Utah. Often we have an inversion or two during our session, and that often gives issues of environment and energy and air quality kind of added emphasis. In 2019, the governor had issued kind of a moonshot of asking in his budget, which he always issues before the legislature begins, of $100 million for air quality issues. And last year, he received about $28 million of that $100 million ask. And does it seem like perhaps that dollar amount of getting $28 million when you ask for $100 is significant in 2019, except for that's the highest ever. And his efforts to kind of throw out that moonshot definitely inspired the legislature to act. In his 2020 budget, the governor also, again, asked, and this is, thinking that the tax reform package would hold for another $100 million to be spent on air quality. Ultimately, he got just under $10 million for air quality, but there were some interesting factors here. One, the failure of tax reform meant that the general fund in particular was very thin. This will be a topic that Steve covers when he talks about taxes, and that Billy will cover a little bit in budget. But there wasn't as much money potentially in the general fund for air quality projects, which is where these would originate. So that impacted what was able to be received. There was also significant pressure at the end of the session because of concerns about coronavirus to shift funds into mitigation accounts for the virus and into rainy day funds. And that was a killer to some air quality projects. But there's a few big issues that we're able to pass, and we wanted to highlight those for you. The first, HB 396, and this one's actually a $50 million potential program to address air quality issues. It is not out of legislative funds, which is why you're going, well, Kate, you just told me it was just under 10, but now you just said 50. This bill allows essentially for a large-scale utility, Rocky Mountain Power, to build out a vehicle charging infrastructure program. And essentially what they're able to do is use ratepayer funds from the ending of the STEP program and just essentially keep that designation of funds going, but shift it to this new project, vehicle charging infrastructure, and shift about $50 million over to work on that charging network. Next, HB 59. This is a tax credit for Class 8 and Class 9 vehicles to use natural gas, electricity, or hydrogen as a fuel source. These are our two biggest categories, essentially, of trucks. These are buses, dump trucks, garbage trucks, cement trucks, semi-trucks. And so these are some of those big ones, you know, for if you think of a garbage truck circling your neighborhood every week, where if they could be converted to a different fuel source, that would help address air quality needs. So this bill passed and was funded. The next one, HB 235, is a new idea, and this is a pilot program bill to come up with an energy savings score, essentially, for homes. So if you think of perhaps when you've purchased a vehicle and there's that fuel mileage rating sticker on the window of a new vehicle that tells you what you can expect to pay for gas for that car, this is like the same idea but for a home, so that a buyer would know, you know, what the energy efficiency was of that home, the cost savings, the air quality impacts. And it applies to just single-family homes. But the idea is that perhaps if buyers knew or understood those energy costs, they might make different buying decisions, or they might be encouraged to do energy-efficient upgrades, things like that. So it's a pilot program, and it did receive $50,000 in one-time funding to try and set that up. And then finally, HB 259, this is another bill aimed at vehicle charging by Representative Spenlove. It would encourage UDOT to collaborate with the private sector and local governments to continue building out this vehicle charging network, to take it further along state highways, so that it isn't just perhaps from Salt Lake to St. George that you feel comfortable taking your electric car, but you could feel comfortable going to Richfield or going to Escalante or other places like that off the main I-15 corridors. And this one was able to have its price tag kind of absorbed within UDOT's budget, which helped it receive funding this year. Next, alcohol legislation. You know, we just always enjoy that this is an area of policy that is unique to Utah, and we continue to be a little bit unique in this area. Those of you that maybe have lived in other states or familiar with other states know that wine subscription services, wine of the month clubs, are very popular, and we haven't been able to do those in Utah. They have been banned. Representative McKell brought a bill, and Senator Davis also brought a very similar bill. The two bills kind of moved their way through. Ultimately, McKell's became the vehicle for this idea of how could we facilitate wine subscription accounts for Utahns who want to purchase specialty wines. Originally, the bill started out with kind of a direct-to-home subscription service like you might see in other states. It was modified through several compromises. Essentially, what the bill would now allow is a person is allowed to sign up for a subscription service, a Wine of the Month Club, but they will place that through the Utah DABC. The wine will still have a markup of the 88% that you traditionally see in state liquor stores. The purchaser would pay the cost of the subscription service. They would pay sales tax, and they would also pay a handling and service fee to Utah DABC to do this. Whether the price point of this will work for people remains to be seen, but it is an interesting step forward for a state who traditionally is very much worried about any type of direct alcohol deliveries to a person's home. So you would pick up, if you decided to move forward with your subscription, you could have it sent to the nearest DABC liquor store to your home. You would go in, show ID, and complete that transaction at the store. But it would allow you to purchase small batch wine that traditionally you might not be able to because of the requirement to order a full case if you do a special order through DABC. It also included a cleanup for a person moving from another state to Utah, being able to move their personal wine collection with them without having to seek special permits. The next one, HB 203, this bill failed Same idea to a certain extent as the wine services bill, but dealing with beer, being able to place perhaps like a DoorDash or a grocery store home delivery beer order and have that delivered to your home. This bill actually was a little more thoughtfully drafted than the wine bill started out with a lot of checks and things like that for the delivery person, licensing requirements, audit requirements, things like that, to try and give legislators comfort in the ability for a safe beer delivery program. Ultimately, this bill failed to even get a hearing, in part because of compromises to stand down on beer issues in particular, from the big shift last year on a change in alcohol percentages in beer. This one is interesting because there may be some people who deeply regret that this did not pass in our new era of needing your groceries delivered to you in order to quarantine at home. The last one, HB 399 here in this category, again, this one ended up being mostly a cleanup bill. A lot of parties from bars and restaurants to event spaces and arenas and grocery and convenience stores wanted to see different changes. Most of those changes were not included in this bill. It was very much kind of a cleanup bill, which again kind of demonstrates Utah's unique kind of position on alcohol. But what it really means is that stand down that was agreed to really on significant alcohol changes held, with the exception of this ability to do a wine subscription program through Utah DABC. The inland port, this had been a very contentious issue for the last several years. Salt Lake City, with a new mayor, Mayor Aaron Mendenhall, who had been the council chair that had negotiated some of the compromises from the original bill, was able to use that relationship with Representative Gibson to introduce HB 347, which included some of the changes Salt Lake City really wanted to see for the inland port. Key among them is some changes to the 11-member board, adding the Salt Lake City mayor, the Salt Lake County mayor, and the mayor of Magna Township to the board. This was accomplished by removing UDOT and the Salt Lake office of the Regional Economic Development Director to give spots to those mayors, which had been a real key sticking point from a few years ago, that those municipalities who have territory in the port felt like they had not been included. It also gives Salt Lake City 25% of the tax increment, the future property tax increment, back. The port would now only get to use 75% of that tax increment. That was also a significant win for Salt Lake City. And it also allows for municipalities in the port area to serve as the final arbiter of any land use ordinance issues. Again, this was a real sticking point for those cities on their land use authority. Salt Lake City was quite happy, communicated that they were very pleased to see some of these changes. They did not, though, agree to drop their lawsuit, which will still go to the state Supreme Court, in order to get some final decision-making on some of these issues about city authority versus state authority for the port. So many happy parties on the inland port bill on HB 347, although some still not. Environmental groups, to a certain extent, still not happy. SB 112 by Senator Luz Escamilla did add some requirements for developers that want to qualify for any of this tax increment financing to have to consider waste reduction and reuse, to be thoughtful about how they manage hazardous materials and stormwater and dust mitigation. And so was able to work in some of those environmental shifts that Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County, the surrounding area, and some of those environmental groups wanted to see. And this picture I've given you here is actually the marina at the Great Salt Lake Marina, mostly because whenever I think of an inland port, I really think there should be boats. And so this is near where the inland port area is. And so anyway, this picture was just a little bit of personal humor I injected as I was trying to find something that would be representative of ports and shipping. Next, this is a perennial bill, and I think Billy and I are, in particular, are super excited that something is passed here so that we can stop tracking it in future sessions. For many years, we've had debates about daylight saving and what time we should be on, and different groups wanting different times. SB 59 would move Utah to permanent Mountain Daylight Time if, it's got two conditions, Congress has to approve it, and 4 other Western states also join us in a permanent Mountain Daylight Time designation. This is all about whether you like in the winter your extra daylight in the morning or in the evening. This proposal would mean more daylight in the evening. And so hopefully at some point when we can get back to worrying about other things, some other states will join us and we won't have to do the changing of our clocks twice a year. This was an area on e-cigarettes and vaping that was set up to really be a big issue this session, and it did occupy quite a bit of time. Of course, in 2019, there were all kinds of stories in the news about the health impacts of e-cigarettes, and particular black market pods, and the impact those pods sometimes have on people's lungs. So there were a series of bills that were introduced. These are the 3 that passed. SB 37 is significant because it adds a tax on e-cigarettes that had never existed before. E-cigarettes had just been taxed at the sales tax rate. So this introduces a tax of 56% of the MSRP. The sponsor had wanted to go higher, up to 86%, but 56% was what was selected by the entire legislature through negotiations, and it matches the rate for cigarettes. Other important provisions in this bill are that e-cigarettes and related products like the liquid pods will contain a nicotine warning statement on the container, and there'll be itemized receipts. This had been an issue that was flagged that sometimes nicotine and e-cigarette retailers that were not on the up and up would not list on the receipt. They'd put the e-cigarette under a miscellaneous category or things like that, which would make tracking down underage sales and things like that difficult. The next one, HB 58, deals with schools. Many schools felt like they were in a difficult area of what to do in terms of when they had a student who was using an e-cigarette on their grounds. And this bill says that one, students are prohibited from having or using an e-cigarette on school grounds. It allows for the confiscation and disposal or destruction of the e-cigarette, because sometimes schools were essentially having to give the device back to kids at the end of the school day. It also allows them to turn it over to law enforcement if there is some worry that the e-cigarette maybe doesn't contain nicotine but contains another drug, and they want law enforcement to follow up on that. It also gives schools an annual stipend to help do prevention classes in either the 4th or 5th grade, and adds an e-cigarette component to the substance abuse and underage drinking groups that already exist. Finally, HB 23 by Representative Hawkins moves all flavors for e-cigarettes, with the exception of mint, menthol, and tobacco, out of grocery stores and convenience stores and into age-restricted tobacco specialty shops. The mint, menthol, and tobacco carve-out matches what exists for traditional cigarettes, and moves all of those flavors that you've heard of, like Fruit Loops or cotton candy, into these age-restricted stores, so that hopefully those that are not old enough to be using these products aren't able to get them, because they'll be having to go into a store where they'll be showing ID and where someone that is young would stand out. It also includes state preemption. So this will, again, require that cities and counties don't do different things from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that will have the same rules in place, no matter whether you're in Brigham City or in Vernal. All right. And I think, let me see, did I go one too far? This is the joy of, all right, I think I may have lost a slide on drug costs. But real quickly, I just want to mention, before I turn things over to Steve Young, there were a couple interesting bills dealing with drug costs. HB 207 by Representative Thurston deals with insulin costs. This was a very hot topic this year, and it includes some caps depending on the type of insurance plan you're on and the different drug formularies that exist on the amount that you could pay for your insulin prescription for a 30-day supply. So it's a very important bill for people that have seen those insulin drug prices spike. There were also two different bills, HB 272 and SB 183, that dealt with the response from an audit the state had done on our public employees health plan, on the pharmacy benefit manager that public employees health plan used. And the audit revealed that the state had some difficulty in gaining access to their own data in terms of costs and issues like that. So there were two different bills that tried to produce more transparency into kind of an unseen layer of healthcare, the pharmacy benefit managers, in terms of reimbursements, of transparency of data, in particular between the PEHP plan and any of the state paid Medicaid type plans. So those were also two interesting bills, again targeted at transparency and costs in our healthcare sector, particularly on the pharmacy benefits side. So with that, I will pause if there is anyone that has any questions on my slides before I move things over to Steve Young to talk about taxes. Again, if you want to type any questions into that Q&A line, feel free to do so now for me. Otherwise, we will move on to hear from Steve Young.
Thank you, Kate. This is Steve, and like all of you, I am sitting at home, and I can just picture all of you in your home offices or your home kitchens, and it's pretty miraculous that we can do this, and quite a nice benefit to living in 2020. If this pandemic had happened 50 years ago, none of us could do anything like this, but we're still having conference calls and webinars and exchanging information. It's continuing on, and my favorite meme has been, our forefathers were asked to go to war, we're asked to sit on our couch. We can do this. And I think all of us, hopefully are getting along okay, and we're just happy that we can continue to present some information to you. I am going to be talking about tax reform and the other tax bills that were passed this past session. Stepping back, going clear back to the 2019 session, we decided we needed to try to pass some tax reform for two big purposes. One, to fix the structural imbalance and the earmark where 100% of our income tax was required by Constitution to go to education. And then number two, to keep our sales tax on track with the economy and up with inflation and the economic activity and growth. The first purpose is much more urgent. That's the one that we really had to address, but it does impact the second to some degree. So in 2019, we had a whole year-long task force. We got a bill passed in 2019 that addressed both issues. Of course, that created some concerns, got repealed by the referendum signatures. Well, got qualified to put on the ballot by January 21st, rather than have a dual track budget system for the next several months before November. The legislature just said, fine, we get the message, we're going to repeal this. So January 29th, that was all repealed. And so that brought us into the 2020 session, and the legislature went ahead and implemented some elements of tax reform. First of all, SJR 9 was passed. That's a constitutional amendment where children and those with a disability will be included within the income tax earmark. Should free up about $650 million from the general fund that can be now paid for out of the education fund if that passes in November. There hasn't been any opposition so far, so hopefully that will, and that will solve a little bit of our problem. The other part of the tax reform that was passed this year was HB 357, which basically guaranteed funding to education going forward. They had a big increase in the WPU and basically put some safeguards in place in statute to guarantee funding to the education community. And they did that without any tax increases, which was helpful. There were a few people concerned that we don't have that in the Constitution, but all told, you'll see all the school associations, including the UEA, jumped on board with this. They recognized as a state we have a problem. We need to fix it. And this allows us to basically increase the flexibility. Every one of these changes goes to that first prong of tax reform. The second prong of broadening our sales tax base remains out there, and people would love to address that. But that prong has been true in all states for several decades. That's not a new issue and isn't a hugely problematic issue. People have been complaining about their sales tax not keeping up with the economy for many, many decades, and states have been looking at different ways to address it. We got a big boost with the Wayfair decision last year, and we're continuing to find ways to keep our sales tax base up with the economy. So that will continue to be a legislative issue in Utah and all the other states for quite some time. So where are we now? Here we sit in March 26th, 2020, and what are we going to be doing going forward with tax reform? The predictions are that this silo issue with the $650 million coming over from the children and the people with disabilities potentially will come around again in 5 to 10 years. Obviously, many of us would love to just get rid of that earmark altogether. It would just increase our flexibility. Obviously, we're the only state that has it, so other states manage to fund their education system somehow without it. But we are where we are with the politics in Utah, and so we're looking at potentially another silo issue in 5 to 10 years, but we'll just address that when we get there. One big question, what do children and disabilities mean? The legislature, I think, has ideas what those mean. We'll see if that's all consistent with what the rest of the state thinks and understands going forward, or whether that creates any political issues one way or another. The user fee for transportation, or the road usage charge, was part of the tax reform in December. There's a lot of studies that are being done in the state through legislative action last year, this year, and otherwise to try to move us in this direction, but there isn't any clear path in the statute like there was in the December special session. So that's something that remains on the table, where, if several Western states can adopt a road usage charge program where it just scans our license plates and charges us for how much we drive as opposed to gas tax, everybody agrees the gas tax is dying and that we need to move toward this ruck. But we're not there yet, and it's going to be a little while technologically before we can get there. Sales tax expansion. The Utah legislature, like other states, is well aware of the political realities now relating to the broadened sales tax on services. Many, many states have tried to do this over the last 40 years. Virtually all have failed. The only ones with this tax are North Dakota, Hawaii, and New Mexico. South Dakota. The South Dakota doesn't have an income tax, and so this just basically replaces their income tax. Hawaii doesn't really care about production in their state because it's all tourism. New Mexico, it just has a really wacky tax code. No other states have really stepped up to try to do this in any significant way. I would be really surprised if Utah does, now that they've tried it in the 2019 session and got significant political backlash, because we don't want to curb our economic production in this state, which this would do. It would just basically create a 6% increased cost of production on anything you try to produce. Clearly, there are options to put taxes on final consumption. That's what we did in the tax reform in December. But the sales tax on food is a political hot potato. The sales tax on fuel is a political hot potato. I think of that, and we probably won't see any of those anytime soon. But you may see, a few other attempts to broaden sales tax to final consumption services. Moving on from tax reform, and I will speak to the various tax bills that were passed this year so that you have an idea what was done. There was a whole bunch that were floated that were not passed, and that is because basically the legislature, didn't quite know where we were with the budget, with the coronavirus, with tax reform, and so they basically stuck with SJR 9 and the prior bill I mentioned as the tax reform bills, and everything else is just kind of put on hold. But there were still several that did pass, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. HB 59 extended the credit for the purchase of an alternative fuel heavy-duty vehicle. That already existed in Utah law. This just extended it out until 2030. HB 200 requires the add back of a federal deduction where one commonly controlled entity owns an intangible asset and transfers it to another and pays a royalty for it, and the recipient pays no income tax on the royalty income. This was an outgrowth of the Seas case in the Utah Supreme Court. The legislature was worried about piggyback taxpayers doing something that was going to cost the state money by tax structuring. So like many states, Utah created an add back statute, but it only applies thanks to an amendment that was put in at the end if an entity owns the IP, transfers it to another, and then leases it back. If you're one entity and you've developed some sort of intellectual property and another entity that's related to you leases it, then that's still not added back, and there's no issue there. That was kind of a collateral damage issue that arose that we addressed. House Bill 269 creates a non-refundable income and gross receipts tax credit for those developing hydrogen electrolysis systems. This was Representative Sagers, who's been working on this for a few years, got it through this year, and basically wants to try to develop hydrogen as an energy source in the state and incentivize that through tax credits. These are all income tax bills, by the way. House Bill 332, Representative Schultz, creates a tax credit for those donating to a special needs scholarship. This has a really quite large fiscal note and is a really great opportunity to get a tax credit for any taxpayers out there to just donate to this option. And Representative Schultz and leadership had a lot of political cachet and got that through. Senate Bill 36 from Bramble prevents Utah from imposing income tax on an employee where the personal service is performed outside Utah, which was really helpful. There was some ambiguity there. And also clarifies that the 60-day withholding tax exemption applies. That was not previously in statute. It is now. The employee, if they come work here, live in Wyoming, come work in Utah, they're still subject to Utah income tax on day one. But the employer with a Wyoming company does not have to withhold on the taxes paid to that or the salary paid to that employee unless they're here at least 60 days. Moving on to sales tax bills, Representative Thurston, House Bill 49, there was some question about where online sales of vehicles were sourced. That's now been clarified to be the location of delivery. HB 53, if you have predominant use of fuel and we exempt industrial uses of fuel, we tax commercial and residential uses of fuel. If you have a meter that has partial industrial use, partial commercial use, like a manufacturing facility with one meter and there's part of the fuel that goes to the manufacturing facility, part that goes to the office, basically that says if greater than 50% of that is used in manufacturing, then you're 100% exempt. That's been the tax commission rule for decades. We just put it into statute. House Bill 280 allows a county to coordinate with the tax commission to determine whether to require a transit room tax audit. This was a potentially really dangerous bill because some of the rural counties feel like their hotels are not properly paying their transit room taxes. The counties wanted audit authority to go audit these hotels, and instead of doing that, which would have been really awful for taxpayers to have 29 different auditors coming after them, the legislature just said the county can basically be a whistleblower, and they can come forward and work with the tax commission and say, hey, we don't think this hotel is paying their transit room taxes correctly. The tax commission will then go do the audit as we've always done and take care of it. House Bill 356, very hot, controversial bill during the session, repealed the sales tax exemption for locomotive fuel. This was one of the carryovers from the tax reform that stuck and actually got passed during the session. This was one of the base broadening provisions that the tax reform task force had in there. Many of the others did not get addressed. This one did. And there was a desire to use some of these sales taxes, $5 million or so that's saved on the exemption for locomotive fuel. They wanted to use that to address railroad crossing issues, and that was done. Senate Bill 114 basically clarifies the lease data center exemption. So if you lease a data center, you're clearly exempt, and put into statute something that's been exempt by rule, which was really important, that lessons are not taxable admissions, and clarified that a lesson is anything where an instructor is present. So there was kind of some ambiguity at the tax commission where, depending on the activity, they were saying, well, if an instructor is present with a golf lesson, it's exempt, but if it's present in another situation, it's taxable. And this clarifies that, look, it's the same for everybody. If you have an instructor present, that is a lesson, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're rock climbing, if you're skydiving, if you're whatever, if there's an instructor there, that's a lesson, and that's not a taxable admission. Senate Bill 194 allows an exempt entity to sell at a special event without a sales tax license. That was unclear in the law, so now they're taken care of. Senate Bill 216 allows counties to collect tax on rentals of ATVs and RVs. This was technically a tax increase, and nobody really pushed back on that because basically the counties, already had that authority with motor vehicle rentals. They just didn't have it with ATVs and RVs, and those were a big deal in rural areas. Senate Bill 225 increases the fees on prepaid wireless services. This was also a pretty significant tax increase, but nobody really pushed back because they all felt like it was fairly reasonable. Senate Bill 239 was the refinery sales tax exemption. Basically, refineries got a broadened sales tax exemption and to incentivize them to move to Tier 3 in 2017. That was largely nullified a year later in 2018 when we took away the 3-year life test. That there's still a few tax benefits that refiners get that the rest of the economy doesn't, and those were set to expire. That there were a couple of the refineries that had not yet moved to Tier 3, so this bill basically bumped it out till 2024 and gave them some more time to get their movement to Tier 3 and not losing those tax benefits in the meantime. SCR 6 requests UAC and the Utah Legal Cities and Towns to provide data so to possibly change the distribution formula just to make sure we're still doing things fairly in light of Wayfair and other things. Lastly, the property tax bills. House Bill 47 was a very important bill, clarified and codified the exemption for educational and charitable institutions to ensure statewide uniformity. Now all educational institutions are exempt if they are just, what you'd think of as traditional education. And all charities are exempt, which include everything else like museums and things that sometimes there was some question about whether they're education or something else. and codified a Utah Supreme Court gift to the community standard, and codified the federal standard for political involvement. So there was really no question there. House Bill 50 clarifies that a home being built as a primary residence receives the primary residence exemption. House Bill 53 increased the personal property exempt de minimis purchase from $150 to $500 and took away the use test. So it used to be if you had to not use it in your business. Now, anything that you purchase after 1/1/21 for less than $500, no matter who you are or what you use it for, is just exempt. And so the de minimis exemption is now $500 per item or $15,000 in the aggregate. So if you're a taxpayer that has less than $15,000 worth of personal property in your business, you're exempt altogether, which has taken off a huge number of filers from the county tax rolls. And the $500 per item should be a pretty good benefit to taxpayers as well. House Bill 77 said if we increase the WPU past 4%, the property tax increase as a result of that will be capped at 4%. And that went into effect this year because the WPU actually went up 6%. House Bill 164, Representative Moss basically changed what's required on the property tax notice to be a little bit more clear. 174 from Lyman allowed all rural counties to use rural healthcare facilities taxes for all healthcare purposes because they were a little bit hamstrung on what they could do. HB 192, and I'll wrap up here because I want to leave plenty of time for Billy, basically just changes the way apartments are valued so that their personal property doesn't get picked up twice if they're valued using the income approach. House Bill 268 allows us to send our property tax bill to somebody besides the owner. House Bill 382 protects your private information. Senate Bill 238 gives the county authority to abate taxes for any taxpayers, including centrally assessed. Senate Bill 141 freezes the multi-county assessing and collecting levy to basically raise money to provide for a state online personal property system to make that system more clear. SB 37 imposes excise tax on e-cigs, and Senate Bill 154 basically allows IPP down in Delta to accept federal money to convert to hydrogen. And with that, I will turn the time to Billy Hesterman.
Thanks, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. It is great to join you in this new forum that we're in. I do like the having us all gathered together, eating our box lunch and talking this way and seeing each other face to face. But now we have the opportunity for you to maybe get to know my three kids who might make some noise in the background, though I think we've got them at bay, and they won't. Fortunately, we're not on a video chat, and they can't come dance behind me and make all of you laugh. Or maybe that would be entertaining for you here at the end. So if you do hear some noises, I do apologize, but they sound like they're at bay at the moment and entertained with different things. So the joy of getting to be cleanup is I'll be brief, just to inform you a little bit about the state budget and what did get put in the budget this year. Just a reminder, if you do have questions or Steve's presentation, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end. But if you've been thinking about it and going, I still want to ask it, go ahead and ask it, and then we'll get to them all there at the end. So as said, I will be talking about the state budget today. And the state budget, a lot of people go, well, what does the state fund versus what is my county government fund or the city government fund? For Utah, largely what you'll hear about in the press when we talk about the state budget is health-related issues with healthcare, roads, so maybe I-15 being rebuilt somewhere, and then also education, or how much our teachers might be paid, or how much we're putting towards a certain education program, bringing technology into the classroom. Those are the types of things that the budget addresses largely, but it also hits a number of other areas within the state, and we'll go over what those are as we go through this. Now, the budget is made through a process that I think many of you are familiar with, so we'll just do a quick recap of this, of how it's done every single year. Usually in December, the governor releases his budget recommendation, and this is exactly what it is, a recommendation to the legislature on what the governor would like to see happen with the state budget, and he often puts in some things that he'd like to see happen. Kate referenced earlier that the budget from 2 years ago, the governor's budget recommendation called for $100 million to be used for air quality. When the legislature did their job and made the actual budget, it ended up being, between $20 and $30 million that actually went to air quality projects. So just because the governor's budget says something doesn't mean that'll be what we get at the end of the process. But it does give the governor a chance to send a signal to the public and to the legislature. This is where he is what he'd like to have happen, and what he would like to see occur. And since he does have the ability to do line item vetoes on the budget here in Utah, he can't even say, do this or else I'm going to make some changes myself when the budget gets my way. So that's what happens there in December, is he gets that first chance to let everyone know what he'd like to see happen. Then we get into the session, and what's interesting is that Utah has a process set up that all 104 legislators are involved in the budget process. They all sit on a legislative subcommittee, and that is divided into certain areas of government. So those subcommittees are business and economic development and labor is one committee. Another committee is the executive offices and criminal justice committee. So they deal a lot with what's happening with our prison and certain areas with criminal justice. The higher education committee, the infrastructure and general government committee, which infrastructure deals mostly with buildings and also with roads here in the state of Utah. The Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Environmental Quality Subcommittee, the Public Education Subcommittee, Retirement Independent Entities Subcommittee, all these different committees that we can count on that they're going to become the experts in that area, that they delve in and really dig deep into the budgets and see what's working right now. And they meet those first few weeks of the legislative session to craft what will be the base budgets, which are passed on the 10th day of the general session. So they go really fast, they dig deep really quick, and they just look for anything that needs to be cleaned up or anything that needs to be altered, and then they make a base budget and pass that on day 10 or before in our legislative session. Once done, the vast majority of the state budget has been put in place. The legislature could adjourn, and Utah's government would continue to be funded for the most part for the year, and then the rest of the money would just be put in reserves. But they want to continue spending the new money that they have. So that's what takes place after that 10th day, is that these subcommittees then are, putting together a wish list of, if we have X amount of dollars, we'll ask for these things to be funded. And so these then subcommittees make a recommendation of their area of expertise that they have to the legislature's Executive Appropriations Committee, who then takes all those recommendations and prioritizes them and puts out a final budget, a supplemental budget that then funds these new funding items for the year. And when that's done, they also then fund the bills that had fiscal notes on them, so a bill that maybe had a program attached to it that needed some money. And that all happens in the last week of the session. So clear as mud, but that is how the state budget is made every single year. Next, it's always interesting to me to see where the money comes from and where it goes. So we'll start with one chart, and I have to give credit to the Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office. They make this graphic every single year. So this is not my work, but their work that is done. The total budget for this year, $20.3 billion for the state of Utah. And where does that come from? Well, as you can see, there's three really big chunks there. The largest one being federal funds, so our federal government being the 27% making up of our state budget, and then the education fund being 25%. That is, of course, funded fully by our income taxes, and then the general fund, which is largely funded by sales taxes here in the state of Utah. As you can see, they make up 25% and 14% respectively. And as we go on, there's a different areas that we can look at. The Transportation Investment Fund is an earmark actually out of our sales taxes, and the Transportation Fund itself comes from the gas tax that is paid here in the state of Utah. So different areas of where the money comes from. And then where does it go? How do we spend it? Well, right now, the thing that gets the largest amount of of budget here in the state of Utah are social services. So think of things of Medicaid and the different programs we do here in Utah to support those with different health issues that come up. Also, education being a large portion when you combine public ed and higher ed, even more than social services, takes up a large chunk of the state budget. So higher education and public education, big areas that Utah does give attention to and a lot of money to, despite what's always put out in the press. And then also different areas where the money gets spent are capital facilities, debt service, law enforcement, transportation, all things that are crucial to helping the state provide the services that they're expected to provide, and we keep moving. So that's where the budget ended up this year, is $20.3 billion, and that's how it was spent. Some of the highlights that were put out there: this was the year of education. The WPU increased by 6%, so that went from 3,532 per WPU unit to 3,745. WPU is roughly per student, per pupil funding, but there are scenarios where a pupil or a student might be 1.5 WPUs or might be something less. So it's just a rough estimate of how much we're spending right now per student. This is also that 6% increase came from the negotiations to pass SJR 9, which Steve referenced earlier. Other highlights from the budget: $24 million has been set aside for state expenses related to the COVID-19 virus that we're all dealing with right now. $1.5 million for vice presidential debate that Utah will be hosting in the fall. $2 million for the rural electric charging infrastructure, which Kate talked about earlier. $3 million for Olympic venue infrastructure improvements. We all know that the state is vying to host the Olympics once again, and so they're starting to put some money in there to make sure that the current venues that we do have are in a state that is ready for Olympic competition. Also, a lot of money deposited into the rainy day fund. Just so you know where we're at right now, the general fund of rainy day funds is at $261.7 million, and then our education fund just over $500 million of $555.4 million sitting in the rainy day fund there. I think we'll see that we'll want to be watching the rainy day funds and how they're used over this year, as things have changed since even the end of the session. And since the budget was crafted, I think those rainy day funds might be called upon in the coming months if things continue the way they are at the moment. How will COVID-19 impact our state budget? I think this is something we'll have to keep our eyes on. It's a little bit of a crystal ball. We already know, talking to our friends in Colorado, Holland & Hart has a good lobbying team there. They've informed us that in December, Colorado projected to have an $800 billion new revenue for their upcoming fiscal year. Those projections now are flat. And so while they were hoping to, create all these new programs and fun things that people have been hoping to have, all the new money they were expecting to get for the new year are gone because of what's happened with COVID-19. And so they're now trying to pass a skinny budget here, and they may have done so now, that doesn't fund anything new, but keeps government, open and the lights on, and get out of their session so that they can get to safe social distancing practices that we've all been asked to do. And so that's what's happening in one state. What does that mean for Utah? Well, we'll have to see how the projections come in, but certainly we'll know there's going to be less money than what was projected, at least temporarily. And so will we need a special session to correct those budget impacts that are made by what's happening right now in the economy? That's yet to be seen. We've heard some rumors of maybe April of the legislature coming back and making those adjustments, so maybe it could be later. Also, will we have a need for additional funding for public health issues? And then employment numbers, what will those not do in the different areas of how Utah is impacted? So lots of questions being asked of what can Utah do to respond to this, and we're kind of in a wait and see. But also knowing that we have, nearly $800 million in rainy day funds, I think Utah's in a good spot to make sure that they can weather this storm and do so in a way that's, a minimal impact to the government services we enjoy, and also a minimal impact to the taxpayer. So that's some of the things that to be looking out for in the state budget. Of course, if you have any questions, it looks like right now the chat bar is clear. If I said $800 billion, I meant $800 million. I didn't mean to say that. So thanks for the heads up there, Kate. And I again, appreciate everyone being here. Want to be respectful of your time. Said we'd keep it to 1 hour, and I think that's where we're at. So.
If there are any questions, we're happy to take those in the chat bar. Hopefully everyone has figured out how to access that. On my screen, it is in the lower right corner, but I think Charles' instructions might have said it's in the upper left for those that are attending. I want to just mention for any of you that are listening, we do have a firm microsite that we have set up for anyone that has questions on legal issues related to the coronavirus. There are obviously a lot of questions that have come up from kind of government responses to legal questions for workforce, for businesses, how transactions and commerce can still flow. And so we've set up a microsite to address those. We've got a special team working across different sectors of legal issues and government response. And that website is coronavirus.hollandhart.com. You can also access it off of our main firm website as well. All right, I am not seeing any questions in the box unless...
Kate, I do see a question. It came in from Keith Pitchford, and he asks if there are any issues that could lead to a special session that we know of currently.
Thanks, Keith. Sorry, maybe we can't. I need to make this box bigger. Luke, if you'll just continue to let us know if any questions pop up. Clearly, the coronavirus and budget issues are likely to lead to a special session. As Billy mentioned, you know, it's kind of the end of his presentation. It is very likely that we could be in an April special session. The question is how do you safely convene folks? How could we maybe have 104 legislators convene via WebEx or Zoom or any of these things we're all using now? But I think it's clear that the state is probably going to have to deal with some budget issues, if not some questions of how we streamline or enable different government processes to go forward so that people can react quickly to things. Just to give you an example, you know, we've been working with a client who wants to be able to manufacture hand sanitizer, convert some of their process to manufacturing hand sanitizer. Doing so involves the transportation and shipment of alcohol. Alcohol law is tricky, and DABC does not have very much flexible authority under their authorizations to be nimble. Perhaps things like that will come up in a special session as well, so that government can be a little bit more nimble in reacting to the different things that come up as we continue to deal with this pandemic and our government response. Billy or Steve, feel free to chime in if you think there are other issues beyond budget and coronavirus that may result in a special session.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I would say we're in an election year. A lot of our legislators want to work on being reelected, and so I think they'd like to avoid a special session if possible.
Here, I'm getting a question from via text message, so it's not going to show up everywhere. And it's from Greg Herzog, who's joining us from Texas. He wants to know when we can expect interim studies to be released. So, Greg, traditionally, the Legislative Management Committee would meet in April. They would set our interim study schedule and the interim study topics, and our first interim committee hearings of our legislature in joint committees would begin in May. For this year, who knows? It'll be interesting to see if we are a little bit delayed because of worries about how to have the management committee meet, or to have the joint committees of interim meet and maybe they'll push back interim meetings to later in the summer. Who knows, maybe the president's right and we'll be meeting earlier. I'm not optimistic, but that would be our usual timeline. Is committee chairs would be sent their study topics sometime in April. They would have their first meetings in May, organize their agendas, and set out their study schedules. This year, best guess is just expect that some things will be delayed and slower as we figure out how to do all of this, but do it in a safe way, yet also have transparent government. All right. Any other questions, Luke, that we can't see on our screens?
No, I haven't seen anything else.
All right. Well, with that, if you have any other questions, feel free to email or call any of us individually. I recognize that here on the slide, we've given you our emails and also our direct office lines. We are, of course, all working remotely now, following directives to reduce the spread of the virus, but our firm system emails us all of our voicemails. So if you do have an individual question for us, feel free to use those numbers and it will email the voicemail to us and we can call you back. Of course, many of you probably already have our cell phone numbers as well. So with that, thank you for spending an hour with us, your lunch hour. And we look forward to, in 2021, doing our session preview with you again in person. Hopefully that will be, this will all be well behind us, and that'll be, again, an option for us to meet together as a group. Until then, please stay safe and wash your hands and let us know if there is anything we can do for you from a firm perspective.